So I'm going to tell you a story about a guy named Andy. Andy has given permission for clergy to use his story. It's a powerful one about betrayal. But before I get to Andy's story, I want to talk to you a little bit about Jesus and his betrayal. If you heard in the readings today, Jesus was betrayed. He was betrayed by a man named Judas. Judas was his friend. Judas was in charge of the money for the movement and the mission that Jesus had started. He was the treasurer. He was trusted and he was a friend. And he betrayed Jesus. So we're going to hear about that in a second. But how about Andy? So Andy, he's a neat guy. Andy was he was in high school, his last year in high school, in a small town in Indiana when Pearl Harbor happened, when the attack on our Navy ships in Pearl Harbor occurred. Andy, like many of his students and like many people in the country, flocked to the recruiter's office to join in the military to fight against tyranny. Andy decided to join the Navy simply because it was the shortest line at the recruiter's office. Now, Andy had some experience with a boat. His dad's little 12-foot boat that they would go out fishing with in a local lake. He'd never seen salt water, never been to the ocean, but decided that the Navy was for him. And so he served in the Navy. He left his high school sweetheart. He left his friends and his family in this small rural town in Indiana and heroically went out and served our country, as many, many people, and some of you here today have done. He returned when the Pacific Theater was finished with their job. He, like the other service men and women, returned, and he came into the port at San Francisco. And from there, he boarded a bus and drove halfway across the country back to Indiana to resume his life. Andy had changed. He was more mature, certainly wiser. He had self-esteem. He'd been through a lot, and he had survived. And he was a good man. He met Susie, who was his high school sweetheart. She, in fact, had been waiting for him to return. And it seems as if their relationship left off like those 4 years that never happened in just 5 years. It just started again. And within a year and a half, they were married. Andy and Susie had a wonderful, loving relationship together. They had 2 children. Their oldest is a daughter, and she currently lives in Ireland. She's serving a large manufacturer of software. I'm not going to mention the name. They have plenty of advertising. They don't need me to say it. She's serving in Ireland. She met her husband there, and they have 2 kids. She's become an Irish Roman Catholic, and he never sees her. Her life is in Ireland. Her family's there, and that's where she stays. Andy and Susie's youngest child is a guy who lives in the East Coast in New York. And he's in a relationship that he and his partner have sworn that they will never have kids. And so Andy had to go through the grief of not seeing his grandchildren around, but it's okay, he had Susie. Susie was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, and 5 months after her diagnosis, he was weeping at her funeral. She went way too quick. 2 weeks later, Andy found himself sitting in their family home. A retired, successful businessman. He owned a Buick dealership. And he was contemplating his life. Why, in fact, he was still alive. That's when he heard a knock on the door. He got up to answer it, and standing on his doorstep was a woman who looked identical to his wife when he met her after World War II. She was a 22-year-old woman named Katrina, and the splitting image of his wife. He thought God had played a cruel trick on him by taking his wife early, and now God had played an even crueler trick by having an angel appear before him in the image of his wife. Katrina broke the silence and said, "I'm looking for Susie Armstrong." It was his wife's maiden name. He said, choking back tears, "I'm sorry you missed her. She died 2 weeks ago." And at that point, Katrina started weeping, sat down on the front stair of his porch, and wept. He sat down next to her and said, What brings you here? And she said, I'm Susie's granddaughter. This threw Andy into grief and betrayal like he had never known. He found out the age of this woman's mother and found out that Susie had had a child while he was in the Pacific Theater fighting for our country. She had never mentioned anything about a child or putting up for adoption. She was dead. He could not confront her about it. Betrayal. A couple things that have to work for betrayal to happen. First one is someone who you thought you could trust. The person has to be trustworthy, or you think you can trust them. Number two is they have to be not who they say they are, or they somehow have to turn against you. So you have to trust them, and they have to either be somebody who they're not, or somehow turn against you. And lastly, betrayal is always motivated by selfishness. It is motivated by selfishness. My friend Jim, I could trust him, I thought. My friend Jim was not who he said he was, or who he was portraying to be. And Jim did this because of selfishness. He knew that I would never be friends with him if I knew that he was the man who he was. And I have to this day have a hard time making friends because of my experience with Jim. That's betrayal in a nutshell. Trust, turn against, for selfish motives.